Great if they don't.
Yeah,
Great.
okay. Well, anyway, you're the lucky people because Slow Rise is, now I'm a baker's daughter. So for those of you that might not know, I'm a baker's daughter. And the thing that I loved about this book was, A, it's gorgeous. But what Dan Leader does, I was reminded of this when I was looking at the book and thinking about Dan. One time we had Jacques Pepin and Julia Child for an event. And what the question I asked them was, who was their favorite person that they ever made a meal for? And I actually forget what Julia Child said, but Jacques said that cooking was an act of love. So he loved cooking for people that he loved. And when I was reading the beginning of Dan's book, and Dan talked about the baker's book, that inspired Dan, Ed Brown, that it was about the act of love. And then in the short time that I've gotten to know Dan since he married my husband's cousin, it's Dan's spirit of generosity and affection that does infuse what he brings to baking bread. Aside from his books winning the IACP awards, or his last book won the James Beard Award. And I'm a terrible cook, and I'm an even worse baker. But as I read this book, I thought, I'm going to tell Kevin to learn how to make all this bread, because you do begin to feel like real people to do this. So I am delighted that you're here. I don't know about you, but I'm already thinking about the people I'm going to give the book as a gift to. So Dan Leader, welcome to RJ Joyce.
Thank you, Roxanne. So, I thought that my last book was going to be the last book. I really thought that. And then when it became clear that I was getting near retirement and my son was going to take over the business, I began to reflect on it's this year it'll be 50 years in the food business. So I started thinking about 50 years in the food business, and that started thinking about how did I end up owning a bread bakery. I was a philosophy major in college, so I kind of I started off life not having any clue, knowing what I was going to do, and then if you want to call it my life plan or my business plan in life, has been nothing more than a series of accidents that I happened to meet someone at the right time. I started reflecting on all this, and then I was speaking to my editor one day, and she said, "Well, do you think you might want to consider doing one more book?" And then it kind of came together very slowly. And what's interesting, like when you write a book and it's done and you start to think about the whole process, it was important for me to kind of retrace my steps a little bit and to see how point A led to point B and led to point C. And so I think I'm going to just spend a few minutes kind of highlighting the journey. And then I'll talk about what motivated me and this wild ride that I've been on. So I'm at the University of Wisconsin, and I show up. It's the early 70s. The turmoil of the 60s has just kind of slowed down a little bit, but it was still very much there. And I moved to Madison, Wisconsin, on this very famous street called Mifflin Street, where all the protests took place in the 60s. And on the corner is a food co-op. And it's one of the first, food co-ops in the United States. They've been there for a while, called the Mifflin Street Food Co-op. And I go in there the very first time, and you have to remember, back these early food co-ops, it was just like bins of oats, and it was not like Whole Foods today. A little produce, a little cheese, And there was this big bin of whole wheat flour, and next to it was this book by Edward S. Brown, you know, and the book just called to me. And so I went home and I am reading this book, and he's talking about the bread making process. And that basically bread makes itself, and you're just helping it along. That, people have been making bread since the beginning of time. And he's a very poetic writer, and he's also a Zen Buddhist. And he, part of his teaching is that you have to experience what you're doing. So here I am, 18 years old, very impressionable, and I know nothing about Buddhism, and the premise was you immediately do, and then you teach. Okay, you want to share what you know. And what happened was I started baking at home, and the kids in the neighborhood started hearing about me baking bread. Of course, I had no clue what I was doing. And before I know it, I'm being invited to dinner parties to break bread with people. Oh, can you bring the bread that you made? And I learned, accidentally, that it's really kind of a calling card. You go anywhere with a loaf of bread and people want to talk to you. And I guarantee if any of you do that, the same experience. So I start baking, I start making friends. Then I end up getting a job in the dish room in the basement of the university, where we were literally washing tens of thousands of dishes a day. It was in the basement of the Red Scholar, and there were like 12 restaurants, and it was just like hot, sweaty work. And I was good at it. And then I get offered a job as a breakfast cook, because I would show up on time and in the dishwasher. And that's the first good skill in anyone in the food business. If you can show up on time and be seemingly alert, you get a lot of raises that way. And so I ended up getting a job in the kitchen. And then my boss said to me, you're pretty good at this. You should think about the food business. And then I find myself at the Culinary Institute of America. The next year, I dropped out of college. I went to the Culinary Institute, and I got thrown into, it was actually a very interesting time in the culinary, because it wasn't this fancy place like it is now in Hyde Park. It was just a bunch of old European chefs, in broken down kitchens, and doing kind of old style food. But I was very lucky to work with, the chefs who had, worked all over in Switzerland or France or Germany or Italy. It was very, very old school in a sense. And I became friends with chefs, and I immediately started going down to the bake shops, and even though baking wasn't a big deal about it, I was always drawn to it. And the funny thing is, my first job in New York, which was a very hot restaurant back then, is now the new hot restaurant in New York. It's been bought, and there's a place called Le Vaudor, and it's being written about in all the food magazines now. And it was my first job in New York, and I was thrown into restaurants where in the early days, I was always the only American in the kitchen. It was a bunch of French chefs and me and a bunch of Spanish dishwashers. And so I was thrown into this world of cooking and having to learn French very quickly if I wanted to survive. And the restaurants I worked in would close every August. Back then, even in New York City, French restaurants always closed for the month of August. My colleagues would go back to France every year. I would get invitations to go visit them. I go to France several years in a row in the summertime, and everywhere I went, my friends would take me to the local bread baker, to the local boulanger. And so I started going to bakeries, and then little by little, I just kind of became less enchanted with fancy food. I ended up working in very high-end restaurants in New York. I ended up, kind of, I didn't realize it, but I ended up missing that experience of dish sharing bread with people that I had done in college. And so I started moonlighting at some of the old Italian bakeries in New York City, D&G, bakery, and there was Zito's, and there was, so I became friends with all these like Italian bakers. And then I started going to Europe and visiting bakers there more. And then I decided I wanted to get out of New York, and I moved my family upstate New York, and I opened a company called Bread Alone. And we started in 1983. And my son is now running the company. But over the course of that trajectory, I became I became a somewhat skilled baker over the years, but I never went to baking school. And I think I consider myself very lucky that I got interested in bread in the pre-internet age, because back when I started, there were no bread books. There was the Tassajara bread book that I mentioned before by Edward S. Brown, but there were literally no baking books, no traditional baking books. So if I wanted to learn about bread baking, the type of bread baking that I really enjoyed, that kind of European style baking, the only way to do it was to go visit bakers. So over the course of, even before I opened Bread Alone, and even after I opened Bread Alone, every opportunity I had, I would go somewhere in Europe, and I became very skilled at talking myself into any bakery. Like, I learned all the key words, whether it was in German or French. I mean, I speak French fairly well and Italian well enough, but I could talk myself into any bakery. And so the skills that I've learned over time were not school skills or textbook skills. I learned from bakers who were doing. And I consider myself really fortunate, because not only did I get the experience of learning the craft, I also got to experience the cultures and the people and the way of life, and how people talked, and how people related to their product, and how they related to their customers, and how they designed their shops, and how they did all their little things. So my last book, which is somewhere here, talks very much about traveling through Europe, visiting bakers. The last book was called Living Bread, and it's about the lives of bakers. And I profile bakers from all across Europe. It's right there. And this book is a very different book, because I wanted something that was a little more user-friendly. I purposely, when we photographed the book, when you look through the photos, I didn't want anything too perfect. Like, I wanted people to feel.
No, Dan, it looks pretty close.
No, but I mean, like, if you go and see what people are doing on Instagram now, they're doing bread stencils, and they're taking razor blades, and they're making all these fancy cuts on their breads, and they have, special ways to do this thing and that thing. A lot of what do they call them, hacks? They call them Instagram hacks. They have baking hacks that you can go on Instagram and see. And so I mean, like, even if you look at the cover of the book, I mean, these are very, very beautiful breads, but it's just a simple loaf of bread with a cut down the side. It's not anything spectacular or extraordinary. It's more about the bread than the fancy presentation, and almost everything in the book is here. So the other theme that I explore in the book, so I've got a little bit about my background. I've got it's called Favorite Recipes from 4 Decades of Baking with Heart. So there's a lot of emotion in the book. I have a whole chapter called the soft skills of baking, not like what temperature and how long do you mix it and when do you know if it's proofed, but kind of your relationship to when you're making the bread, and how that feels, and what do you look for, and what if your bread isn't exactly what you planned for? Like, are you going to be disappointed? I mean, like, we're kind of like, maybe it was the emotional skills of baking. So I talk about that, but then another theme that I explore in the book is just how different the bread world is now. Like, when I started, organic foods was like in its infancy. I mean, it was considered extreme that we were an organic bakery in 1983, that we were using organic flours. Now it's mainstream. Back then, there were so few sources of flours and specialty grains. I mean, it was really hard to find consistent supplies of organic flour. Now you've got farms in the Northeast, you've got new mills popping up. I have a list in the back of the book. In every state of the country, I found a local farm or mill that's growing local flours. So I have a chapter in the book. It's that no one's really named it, so I call it non-commodity baking or non-commodity flours, because most of what we buy, even King Arthur, it's a commodity. I mean, King Arthur flour is not milled by King Arthur; it's milled by huge flour mills, and it's private labeled. Okay, so when you bake with grains that are grown in Connecticut or Vermont or Maine and milled at a small mill, it's a very, very different baking experience than if you get, a commercially produced flour. And so I have a chapter about, well, how do you deal with non-commodity flours? So I have a whole section on there. Throughout the book, it's peppered with recipes with einkorn and spelt and different types of rye flours, and the different varieties of grains, that you can find. And because I'm always I'm always looking for new things, and trying to learn new things. And I know a lot of bakers around the world. There's a group in France that was started by a group of, they call them moth bakers, Meilleurs Ouvriers de France. It's like if you ever see chefs or bakers, and they have the little red, white, and blue collar. That's considered they're considered moths, Meilleurs Ouvriers de France, and you have to pass this big test, and it's a very arduous process. But there were a bunch of moth bakers that were starting to have health problems as they got older. They were getting diabetes, and they were high blood pressure, and so they started working with the National Institute of Health in France. And they basically realized that although they were making simple breads, they weren't eating enough whole grains, and they weren't eating enough pulses and seeds. And so they developed this whole approach to bakery, and they call themselves les ambassadeurs du pain, the bread ambassadors. And they developed this new style of baking where you're using way more grains than you are flour. And the flours that you use are all whole grain. And instead of making sourdough the way you would normally make it with just flour and water and thyme and a starter, they're using like cracked millet and oats and amaranth. And they make these mixtures of freshly ground whole grains. And they put boiling water over them and let them soak overnight. And they put just a little bit of sourdough, like a teaspoon of sourdough. And they let this kind of porridge mixture ferment for 24 hours. Okay, so now you've got this very loose mixture of grains that are broken, and they start to bubble and ferment. And they use that as the basis of the bread. And so it could be like 60% of these grains and 40% spelt or a little whole wheat. And so they're very dense breads, but they've had the nutritional analysis done, and they're very high in fiber and minerals and vitamins. So there's been this movement from like the old world bakers in France to become ambassadors of health and nutrition. And it's actually super interesting. And so there's a chapter in the book about going to their school and learning about them. And so in that chapter, I have a bread recipe made with chickpea flour and fermented bran and some wheat flour. And then they also use a lot of dried legumes. So I have a epi, which is a type of bread in France made from beets and barley. Okay. So that's kind of a fun chapter in the book. And And I don't think anyone's written about that yet in the US, so I think this will be kind of an interesting thing. And of course, I wanted to do just some really fun things with the book. So there's a chapter, and I'll show some pictures because it's really fun. I snuck into the Grand Prix de la Baguette in Paris. And so technically, you're only allowed to enter, only bakers in Paris can enter the competition, but it doesn't say who can bake the bread. Okay, so I have several baker friends in Paris. So I called my friend Mikel, who I'm in this picture with here. And I said, Mikel, what do you think if I bake bread with your staff and we enter it into the Grand Prix de la Baguette? So we went to the baguette competition and we snuck in. This is, so when you go in, every baker brings in 2 baguettes and they put numbers on them. And then they have these tables. Let me say, I think there's a picture here somewhere. They have these tables and they just line up all of the baguettes on the table. And then they have a group of judges, chefs, food personalities. The baker who won the previous year's competition gets to be on the panel. And then they set up people at these tables. You can see them here. And they start out with hundreds of baguettes. I think the year that I was there were 330 bakeries that had entered. So they had like 600 baguettes on the table, and the judges had these tables, and they kept narrowing it down. I mean, I don't know how you would begin to pick one, because after about an hour of the competition, after they've cut so many baguettes, the aroma is so strong that it's almost too strong. You almost want to leave the room.
Yeah.
It's just wild, you know, how so I have a chapter about the history of the baguette and my first experience eating baguettes in France and what it's been like to go over the years and the changing style of baguettes, because the baguettes that I had 30 years ago, there's a very different style of making baguettes now. So I have a chapter about that in the book. And then before, I was telling Ellie that one of the things that I did in this book, in my last book, I had visited the national seed bank of Italy with all of the different types of wheat that they grow in Italy. So they basically keep seeds for every type of wheat. So I got a call after that book came out from one of the lead scientists at this organization called CIMMYT. And CIMMYT is based in Mexico, just north of Mexico City. And they have the largest seed bank in the world outside of the Doomsday Vault up in Norway. Okay. And so basically a seed bank is this vault of wheat seeds. And they have to germinate them and propagate them to make sure they're vital. And what they do is they're developing varieties of wheat that get shipped in India and Sri Lanka and all over the world. You know, this is kind of like the resource center, this place CIMMYT in Mexico. And so there's been a lot of controversy in the baking world about old varieties of wheat versus new varieties of wheat. And if any of you read about it, a lot of the, if I could say, the younger generation of bakers feel like modern varieties of wheat have helped create the gluten problems and some of the digestive problems that people have today. And the old style wheat is much healthier and easier to digest, et cetera, et cetera. So when I was invited, so they invited me to come down to this place in Mexico. And I really wanted to understand about the genetics of old wheat versus new wheat. And so here I'm talking to some of the leading agronomists in the world, okay? Not a food writer who wants to write a sensational story. And they're telling me that actually when you look at the genome or the DNA of modern wheat versus old wheat, there might be one line that's different. And so we had all types of discussions about that. And so we got into this whole question of what is the difference between modern wheat and old wheat, and how do you get from an older variety to a newer variety? And so they took me out to a wheat field, and I found this really fascinating. So what this is they're basically crossbreeding two types of wheat in this photo. So what they've done is they've cut off the male spike from one wheat or on a wheat stalk, and they've pollinated the female. And then they take these little socks and they cover the pollinated wheat, okay? Because I don't want it to get pollinated with something else. And it gets to a certain point, and then when they harvest it, then they'll get, let's say they get 500 wheat seeds. They'll take those 500 wheat seeds and they'll plant them and see how they do. And maybe then they'll crossbreed those again. But I purposely put this picture in the book because I wanted to kind of dispel this notion that, there's really a lot of misinformation out there about especially in this world of gluten and gluten intolerance, that it's because of the way the wheat has been, and they almost call it like Frankenstein science. When you read about it, you think like, oh my God, they're really doing something horrible. So here I'm at literally one of the leading wheat research centers in the world. And I, who don't even have a college degree, was able to go there and understand the basics of what they were doing and how they did it. And I found that really, really interesting. So I have a whole chapter about my visit to Simit, okay? And then, because I didn't want this book to be too dense, I just have a lot of delicious treats. Okay, so on one hand, we were in one chapter, we're in the Grand Prix de la Baguette, and another chapter we're in Mexico, and another chapter we're talking about all different types of sourdough, and there's another chapter talking about these new style baking in France. And then for people who just want to learn to make a croissant, I have a really good croissant recipe in the book, and some really, some things as simple as scones. There's a nice pepper scone, and even the some of the pastry recipes. Here's a scone recipe with einkorn flour. So I've tried to, like, even if I could say, the everyday things that people want to make at home, pies and tarts, and here's red pepper Gruyere pull-apart rolls with a brioche dough. Okay, and the brioche is made with a sourdough. I have a recipe in here with a sweet sourdough. So none of my books are like standard cookbooks. They all are adventures, and this book reflects a whole series of adventures and kind of looking back at my life. So with that, I'll take. Is the timing good? We'll just do some questions. Is that good?
It's perfect.
Perfect. Okay. But I'm really proud of it, and
It's beautiful, Dan.
yeah,
It
really
really is a
beautiful.
wonderful book.
Yeah. And actually the photographs in the book have a great story. So I've worked with this one photographer for years, and I only want to work with him, but he lives in Berlin. And it makes a little bit complicated photographing a book. So we decided that since I have this love of France and Paris, that we photographed the book in Paris. So we rented a townhouse in Paris, and we set up one of the bedrooms as the photo studio. And we were baking like in 3 locations, in 2 of my friends' bakeries and in the house. And so all of these photos, not only are they beautiful, but they were all photographed in Paris, And and the other thing that's in the book, there's really some fun stories about my business, which my son is running now. There's a whole chapter about the history of the bakery, and just to talk a little bit about bread alone, it's not a small business anymore. We make about 28,000 kilos of bread every day. We ship all over the north to east. 2 of our bakeries, we have 2 production centers. They're both certified climate neutral. We're the only bakery in the US. And you can see that we have these huge solar panels around our bakeries. I mean, this location is completely solar powered, and the bigger bakery is partially solar powered. So there's a bit about Bread Alone, my company as well. Okay, with that, I'll just take a few questions.
And do you create your own recipes? Where the best?
Well, I borrow. I'm very good at borrowing. I wouldn't say, I would
What's your
say,
favorite
I
thing?
would say that I would say I'm not like the kind of person who just creates things. I borrow ideas and I embellish them. So none of the recipes in the book are like exactly the way things were given me or how we've done, but we take basic I could say like a brioche recipe is a classic recipe. So the brioche recipe in this book has got a sweet sourdough that's made with some sweetener and then variations on that. So, but the brioche recipe itself is a classic.
You got your own.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So everything in the book is a bit our own.
But your recipes have metric as well as imperial.
Yeah, well,
That's really helpful.
the whole baking world is going finally, luckily, is finally going metric. You know, and almost any good baking book that comes out now is in grams and not cups and teaspoons. And ounces.
So this is in both.
This is
Yeah.
in both. And I would have preferred to just keep it in metric. That was a battle I lost with my editor.
Yeah. Because the rest of us don't like that.
Yeah.
Just had a question about the gluten intolerance.
Yes.
So has that been like proven that if you do bake with just the
Um,
more ancient
so-
grains
so-
that resolves that?
So this is a big question, okay? And I'm asked this everywhere I go. So we have to talk about if somebody's got gluten sensitivity
Or is it-
or they've got celiac
Yeah.
disease. So anyone who's got celiac disease,
Yeah, right.
I basically say, see your
Yeah.
doctor and take their recommendation. If people say to me, I have gluten sensitivity, then I have a whole different conversation. And then I will say to them, have you ever tested just eating a very thin slice of whole wheat sourdough bread? And if they say no, I said, well, just try it. Either here's a recipe, do it, or buy one. And you're not going to hurt yourself. You're not going to have a horrible reaction that you take, 10 grams of. But I've had the experience with literally hundreds of clients and customers that they say they're gluten sensitive and they have no problem eating Bread Alone's whole wheat sourdough bread. They have no problem eating Bread Alone's multigrain bread. They have no problem eating Bread Alone's whole sourdough spelt bread. But they do have problems if they eat a white baguette. Okay, it's too processed. There's in my last book, I talk about this in great detail. There's the scientists are saying, and not me, scientists are saying that a lot of gluten intolerance is that people have been eating over processed flour and grains their whole lives. And in addition to the over processed flour, they're eating a lot of products with vital wheat gluten in them, gluten stabilizers, additives, all, like if you look at commercial bread and you look at what's on the label, it's a whole bunch of stuff. But primarily people are eating over refined flour that's been fortified with vital wheat gluten, and our bodies are just not designed for it. And so people have developed a sensitivity. You can get that in pastas, you can get it in very refined white breads, you can get it like not so much the new style pizzas that people are making, these kind of Neapolitan pizzas, but like traditional pizzas. I mean, that flour is high gluten, highly processed flour, and often has vital wheat gluten in it. So the pizza makers can have it stretch really thin. And so there's the consequences of people are having digestive issues.
Dan, do you give a list of vendors or anything? I mean, King Arthur flour is what I see on the
So-
shelf everywhere.
So in the back of the book, I have a list of every small mill that I could find in the country. So I went state by state. I forget how many are in Connecticut.
No,
But-
No,
Do I not have any in Connecticut?
no,
Was that the only state? I thought.
I checked.
Oh, no.
First thing I did.
Most of these places, will they ship something to?
Oh,
you?
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Absolutely. There's one in Massachusetts near Northampton that's not that far from here. And I think it's called Ground Up Grain or something.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
Hadley.
Yeah, that's a very nice mill. Not far from us in Maine is a company called Maine Grains. New York State, you've got Farmer Ground Flour.
And they ship.
Oh, they ship all over. Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is that when you're working with these not commodity flours, it does take some practice. I mean, these flours have not been tested the way a commercial flour has been tested. And so, it's a little bit, there's a little bit of more, you have to practice a little bit more. Make the same bread 4 times and it'll get better each time. But the flavor's different, the texture's different, the flours are not nearly as refined. You're not going to just end up with a white bread. But I've got a lot of resources here. And this movement of local grains is only growing. So as time goes on, this will be a bigger thing and more available.
So Dan, one of the things that I think about, if you're not gonna bake bread, now in the Cody house, we're gonna be baking bread because Kevin's gonna become an expert at
Yeah.
it. One of the things that you think about just for health reasons now is that you should be eating more grains in the bread, more whole wheat.
More whole grains.
More whole grains. So when you go shopping for bread,
Yep.
for those of us that are not baking every day, these labels are near impossible to read.
I mean, listen, I'm gonna knock a product, but I feel like it's okay to knock it. Okay, so if you go buy this Dave's Killer Bread, which is everywhere.
Which is what we buy.
Okay,
Yeah.
Dave's Killer Bread is owned by a company called Flowers Baking Company. And if you look at the label, the ingredient list is like 20 items long, 30 items long. I mean, flour should be grains, flour, salt, yeast, sourdough, like it shouldn't ever be more than 4 or 5 ingredients.
Yeah.
They're putting a product called, and it's not always on the label, they're putting a product called cultured wheat starch. Okay, and basically they take wheat starch and they culture it and they acidify it. So think about when you acidify something, what happens? It's going to taste really, really sour or off. Okay, but that acidification acts as a preservative for the bread, which the hardest part about baking bread commercially is that bread without preservatives will mold. You put it in a plastic bag, it's going to mold. So they've come up with this product, which is not allowed in Europe, called cultured wheat starch. It tastes really awful and it smells really awful, but it will keep bread 30 days without mold. Okay, so what do you do when you put something that tastes awful and smells awful in dough? You got to cover up with something. So you'll see on the Dave's Killer Bread, they'll have all these sweeteners. I'm not sure if
You just ruined everything.
and it has to have a lot. And if you
I
take,
loved you at the beginning of this.
Yeah. no, but I'm just saying that, and I'm using that bread as
So
an
that's why
example.
I'm asking.
That's the reason, that's the problem, is that if you go to the supermarket aisle and you look at, I want to buy a 100% whole wheat loaf of bread with no additives and no preservatives, it's nearly impossible
Yeah.
to get a commercial bread. You might find them in the freezer section of health food stores, but if you look at the dates on these breads, they'll have a 21-day date code if you happen to buy, so you're buying a product that can sit on the shelf. I mean, bread was not designed to stay fresh
Yeah.
for 30 days.
So Dan, what about the idea that the lead ingredient, even if it's only 4,
Yeah.
should be whole wheat?
Whole wheat should be the first ingredient.
So like we buy your bread at Whitneyville Market.
Yep.
They carry bread
So-
alone
And
bread.
you're buying that whole wheat sourdough.
Yeah.
Well, and then bread alone also makes a sourdough that isn't whole wheat,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, so
there's
it's-
2 kinds.
Yeah, so we have a bread called the Whole Grain Health, which is 100% whole wheat and grains and seeds. We have a bread called a whole wheat sourdough, which is like 85% whole wheat flour. And then we've got some lighter breads. There's a multi-grain bread, that's more than 50% whole wheat flour. It's full of flax and millet and the seeds. So there's a whole variety. But if you look at our labels, and I'm not here to try to sell
No,
our bread, but what I think what's interesting is if you just go to the store, if you can buy our bread at the store,
At Whitney
and then go to a supermarket, take a photo of our label
Yeah,
and see what's in our bread, and then go to a bunch of commercial varieties, you'll be shocked what's on the
your
label.
rye bread's amazing,
The rye bread's really good.
amazing.
And that bread is rye sourdough, whole wheat flour, white flour, caraway seeds, salt. That's it.
So the notion is to really, like, if you think about, I'm thinking about bakeries around here. So
Yeah.
Bread Alone, I don't know where else they are besides Whitneyville, but like there's,
You go to our website, you put in your zip code,
yeah,
it'll tell you where the bread's sold.
okay, all right. So that's good for all of us to know. And then like Atticus here
Atticus is
in
a good
New
bake-
Haven,
Atticus is a good bakery.
they label their stuff and they only have a few
Yeah,
ingredients.
yeah. Atticus, they have a big commercial bakery, but they also have a small bakery. And I know the baker's quite good.
Yeah. And then.
I would say excellent. I wouldn't say quite good. He's
And then
excellent.
there's another bakery here, the G Bakery.
Yeah,
They make bread,
G Cafe.
G Cafe.
Yeah.
I think they make their bread also. So your advice is, if you really want this kind of bread, you have to go to a bakery or a local baker or
Yeah.
supplier.
Yeah, but one thing I will say about what's happening, almost every supermarket chain, like, do you have Hannaford's around here?
No,
Okay, but Whole Foods,
Stop and Shop. Stop and Shop is the, or
Stop and
Big
Shop,
Y's.
I'm not sure, but like Big Y will have local bakers. Okay, I've seen that in Boston. I have a friend who's got a bakery in Boston and his bread's in
Big Y.
Big Y. I'll share a secret. It's not a whole grain bread, but it's a really good bread. So if anyone goes to Trader Joe's, we make the San Francisco style sourdough for Trader Joe's. Okay, Bread Alone does.
That's a
So,
good gig.
yeah. I was at the bakery 2 days ago. Yeah, 2 days ago. I didn't realize that they're ordering 9,000 pieces a day.
Wow. So Dan, one last question.
Yeah.
So when I look at this book, and I obviously see a lot of cookbooks.
Yeah.
There's a lot of writing in here. There's a lot of gorgeous photography. How long did it take you to do this book? I mean, this looks like a lot
I
of
said,
work.
Julie, I started before or after we met?
Oh, after 21?
Yeah. So I would say
You
The-
were done in 23.
So,
it
couple
couldn't,
years.
the book could have come out last year if I wanted to, but there were a lot of baking books that came out last year. So we chose to hold it for a year. So, it's been sitting in production for a very long time. And also with COVID, part of the reason it was delayed too, because the publishers were so backed up, the printers in China or wherever they're having them backed up. But I would say it was 2 years of writing. And I work very slowly and I like to think about things a long time. So, I mean, maybe I could have done it in a year and change, but it was 2 years and change.
well, I want to thank you for coming here. I know you did a lot of driving.
So much pleasure.
Dan's son is getting married this
Saturday.
weekend.
It starts tomorrow.
Starts tomorrow. And so I didn't say this in the introduction, but Dan, by some absurd coincidence, we live in a town in Maine. We have a house in Maine that's about the size of this room. And Dan, who lived in upstate New York, coincidentally marries Kev's first cousin and then coincidentally buys a house essentially across the street from us, having nothing to do with us. This was just,
Well, the story goes, we're on our second date and I was just signing the binder on the house.
yeah.
And I said to Julie, I'm buying this house in Castine, Maine. And Julie's eyes light up and I'm thinking, well, how could she possibly know where Castine, Maine is? And she goes, oh, my cousins live in Castine, Maine. And my answer was, well, most likely I'll be their neighbors. And literally takes us about 2.25 minutes to walk from
From
our.
one house to
to
the
the
other
next.
house. But I do wanna, thank you for this, Dan, that. You know, one of the pleasures of being a bookseller is introducing people to books, types of books, genres of books that change their lives. And I do think this is the kind of book, whether you're just gonna read it or learn how to bake, but makes you think about the pleasure of baking for someone else. So even on the way here, I thought of 6 people that, including Edward and Chandler, that I want to get the book for. So I want to thank you all. We're going to have it in our holiday catalog as our top cookbook baking book out this year, because I do think it's that extraordinary. So if you would join me in thanking Dan Levy.